morning to Nicola Lemon, the CEO of Hume Housing, one of the leading community housing providers in Australia with a particular focus on Western Sydney. Nicola, welcome to Western Sydney Unfiltered.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
My staff say everything I've ever done is unfiltered, so there's why the need for a special title. Look, Hume has had a long history of working on social fabric, the classic case of not-for-profit service providers that are taking on the role that government's traditionally taken on. And as the CHPs, the community housing providers, is very much the case. Talk to us about Hume's footprint across the region and the role you play in that housing equation.
Sure. So Hume came about as two very small tenancy management organisations, one in Fairfield and one in Liverpool, that merged together across the Hume Highway. And that's why we're still called Hume. And that was over 35 years ago that happened. So we are definitely Western Sydney born and bred. And it's where our heart and our roots are. We've expanded beyond the Western Sydney, southwestern Sydney boundaries now, but so we grew up here. We have been operating over 2,000 homes in Liverpool, Fairfield, Campbelltown and Parramatta. During that period, we grew from 125 properties 30 years ago to now just under 5,000 properties across a variety of different regions, 2,000 of which in the Western Sydney region. We've been providing social and affordable housing to the community, as well as a range of wraparound services throughout that period. We've also been developing and constructing our own homes with a flagship development in Fairfield.
You can tell you've developed a very good Western Sydney accent via Yorkshire. Coming out of the UK has become obvious to us who can listen to you speak, has a more at-scale, strongly more developed community housing model that some of the major players that we saw at our tour to East London in 19 were massive. Things like Peabody and L&Q, and who have, one of the groups described themselves proudly as having the same size balance sheet as Mercedes-Benz, and the other said, or could we better say it, we subsidised $1 billion of rent last year for our which is a nicer way to think of CHPs within. I'm a strong believer in scale. Are you the thought of scale? There's lots of CHPs in the market. Do you think there's a mood towards maybe scale going higher, to take on more projects, to get more efficient, to assume more public transfer of assets and develop more? Is that a move within the sector?
My perspective on scale is one that, yes, it's good. I've worked for organisations with up to 70,000 properties in the UK, and that experience, and organisations with 4,500, which are really considered small in the UK, very small. And so I could see when I first came into Hume, when we had about 900 properties when I came into Hume, I could see where we could drive efficiencies, where economies of scale would really matter. And ultimately that the scale matters because you can drive efficiencies, drive those economies of scale, and because we're profit for purpose, all of that saving goes straight back into providing more affordable housing. So it absolutely makes sense. That's one of the reasons that have driven Hume to expand its boundaries and to grow. The other thing I think that scale gives community housing providers is we stop being that quintessential not-for-profit and start being a profit for purpose organisation with a business head and a social heart, and in fact to drive those efficiencies and really have respect for our customers' rent that we get and use that wisely. It actually becomes, I often have people work for me that have come out of the corporate sector and they can't believe how hard it is to work in a profit for purpose sector, because you have to do more with less.
Capitalism with a conscience.
Yes.
And that gets the best of both worlds. I mean, that profit drive makes you more efficient. Secondly, it provides a business motivation that essentially is good. But then the fact doing it for purpose or with a conscience is, I think, the head and heart in equal sync. For the uninitiated, to explain that the community housing providers, which the model is either develop your own at a sub-market rent with support and levies and provide that, or to have largely transfer former public housing assets into private not-for-profit management. But you're not just any old landlord, are you? There's a curation comes. There's a tenant curation piece, isn't there? It's not just taking the rent and fixing the light bulb when it goes out. The role the CHP has more social equity play within a normal land management organisation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Hume was the recipient of Australia's largest social housing transfer from public housing to community housing. So certainly the community housing sector is seen as a safe pair of hands for government. They've entrusted us for 20 years, you know, a 20-year lease with their properties. And one of the reasons that that transfer has occurred is not just so that we can tend to the bricks and mortar, as you say, but also so that we can tend to the future of the tenants that live there. So Hume exists and most CHPs exist to create opportunities for people to prosper. And we know that housing is a determinant of that. But once people are in housing, they also need a range of services and supports to help them meet what they aspire to. So Hume has a variety of different approaches to that, links to employment, training, education, structured programs around that for our customers, and importantly, our customers' kids. So ultimately, what we'd really like to do is make generational change. So, you know, that social housing isn't always a destination for the children of people currently in social housing is really important to us. And you do that through providing these links to training, support and education. But then also a number of our customers will be in positions where they're fleeing domestic violence or have drug and alcohol issues. And so we provide support and partner with others to provide the supports needed to help people make some really good decisions in their life. Ultimately, though, Chris, our job is not to tell people what they need. It's to provide them the opportunity for them to then engage with us on their terms and for them to determine what prospering looks like for themselves. So we don't determine that for them. And I think that's key to our success, because people make their own choices, they make wise choices and they succeed. And we see that every day where people move out of social housing into affordable housing and then on into the private rental market because they've stabilised their lives.
Which gives the purpose. And, you know, every day you get to see. And, you know, as you said, you manage tenants who are between drug addiction, mental health, domestic violence and other disability. There's an all, you know, with respect to the housewives of Sylvania Waters aren't the tenants of, you know, of Hume. You're providing a service and the ultimate protection, full walls and, you know, roof that doesn't leak and a home for a family. So it must be kind of nice to have that purpose part of it. You get to play, you know, Monopoly every day and involved in the property game, one of the more stark end of the capitalist world, but be able to do it in a way that's providing a real social equity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's, you know, even if you're not thinking about it in terms of the person's well-being or society's well-being or community well-being, what you're actually doing is we're providing services that have preventative cost mechanisms built into them. So our services stop high numbers of presentations at mental health A&E. Our services prevent kids from truanting and all the costs associated with that. You know, there's so many things. Because we're a housing provider, we kind of pick up everybody because it's the issues that people have that's human nature, as opposed to there's one specific service for drug and alcohol. Everybody has to have somewhere to live, and therefore we have to deal with a range of different issues. And so we partner with lots of people to solve those.
Look, a lot part of the model, and you're also chairman of Power Housing, the group, the representative group that brings the bigger end of the CHPs together. In New South Wales, which state governments still have majority impact on the affordable housing sector, the Premier came to office on day one when she assumed office after Mike Baird. She said, "Judge me on housing affordability. When I'm finished, that'll be the metric she put for herself." Right. At the moment, would she getting a high rating? Has there been enough progress on, certainly from your perspective yet, on a warm embrace of reform and housing affordability, of transfer of assets, of growth of total? Because I've seen the numbers continue to grow for demand for social housing. And that doesn't include the demand for other affordable housing models further up the stream. So if the metric was run at the moment, she got more to do? She a big star, or where do you think it fits in the mix?
I think the interpretation of affordability was about house price affordability, which has no bearing on the end of the market that community housing providers work in. So I've seen the recent stats that came out, the Global Index of Affordability. Sydney's still the third least affordable city in the world, behind Hong Kong and Vancouver. So our customers in Western Sydney are still in a position where if they're looking for a 3-bedroom home in Fairfield, they'll be on the waiting list for 15 years for a 3-bedroom home.
Wow.
You know, there has been such a significant lack of underinvestment in affordable housing in this country that it will require a significant policy intervention to assist to resolve the problem. And the waiting list is growing. Fairfield has got 3,500 people, households on the waiting list currently waiting for a home. You know, Parramatta's got 5,500.
So this fills in. Where do they? Being on a waiting list sounds fine. I'm on a waiting list for a new car or something. We're all sat in a waiting list. If you're on a waiting list for a home, what are you doing?
So you're couch surfing. You're living in overcrowded situations. You're living with family. You're living in completely inappropriate accommodation, a granny flat with 3 of you, or a single mum and a kid in a granny flat, or you're sleeping rough.
You're living in dangerous situations amongst
Correct.
that.
Yeah.
So do you get a sense of urgency? We talk about the 60,000 sort of places spare, go right across the region in Western Sydney that we've looked at. Do you get a sense that government understands that urgency? That there's just in Fairfield alone like 3,000 home families waiting there to get what in some cases is emergency accommodation, let alone they're not, oh, we want to move into the big 5-bedroom house on the golf course we're talking about. This is to move into a place that simply is safe, reliable, dependable for them. They're not on a waiting list for a mansion, are they?
No, let me be clear. There is no choice in waiting. You get what you're given when you get to the top of the list. That's it. So there's no choice. Really, you can the greatest choice is that you can say you want to be within a particular boundary, and even that's challenging when people have family supports, etc. They'll just get placed wherever within that boundary.
Do governments get that sense of urgency? Do they?
Look, I think what's been a silver lining from a COVID perspective in this space has been that one of the great things this government have done is implement a program called Together Home.
Yep.
And Together Home is a housing first model where more than ever before, the public conscious and the government have understood housing as a social determinant of health. And so if you're sleeping rough and you're being asked to go into lockdown, where are you going to go? You've got nowhere to go. So that brought about, and it's brought about in the UK, the US and Australia.
The uninitiated, this is homeless people, rough sleepers who were given largely hotel rooms for a period during COVID. And there's some funny stories. There's some interviews of the guy going, the little shampoos, I'm used to the little shampoos he's using it. And it is hopefully that has changed the dynamic to understand that there was not only a immediate and short-term need to protect people, we're putting them back on the street.
Yeah, and what the government
COVID might have gone, but the threat of violence hasn't gone. The threat of mental health disease hasn't gone. There's one of the many threats is diminishing, but the others are still there when you return, aren't they?
That's right. That's right. Of course. But what the government have done and it doesn't capture anybody, but is introduce a new program that recognises rough sleepers can be put into a property that they choose, and the government have provided funding for those properties, not to develop, to access the private rental market, and funding for supports to help people who've been terminally homeless to get the support they need to get back on their feet. And so that's been a great initiative. And what it's shown me is that when government really puts a focus on something, you can make it happen quickly. And they've utilised the community housing sector to execute that for them. Yeah.
We always need good news. There's so much bad news in social housing. When good news comes along, we ought to celebrate it, which is wonderful. So I grew up on the edge of a place called Dundas Valley. It used to be the biggest public housing estate in the Southern Hemisphere. Parramatta's estate. Blacktown has its Mount Druitt. Liverpool has its Green Valley. Campbelltown has its Anne's and Minto. These great public housing estates that were largely set up for, when they were established in the 40s, 50s, and even 60s, they had a very different purpose, different clientele, didn't they? The change in those where it was working worker housing, where you had government teachers qualified for housing commission. That shift has a big management impact, right? Because we are talking now about, for want of better terms, welfare housing, where people are, there is significant rates of long-term unemployment that's come with that, with mental health and drug addiction we've spoken of before. How well equipped or how appropriate for private organisations like Hume to be managed that? Is that simply government saying, you deal with what is traditionally our problem now? Or is it an appropriate way to manage that type of social service delivery?
Look, I think it's appropriate when there is accompanying dollars for providers to assist, because there's only so much a profit for purpose organisation can do with limited resources. And I'm not sure that CHPs alone can be held accountable for the social ills in every community. What I do know, though, is that those kind of estates that you're talking about, Hume is involved with Fraser's at Tilapia and the estate renewal there. And I've done a ton of that in the UK. It's an area that I'm really passionate about because I can see the change and difference it can make. So the renewal of those estates in partnership with private developers and CHPs and government, I think, is the solution to the problem you're alluding to.
Tilapia was like the last part of the big Dundas Valley estate where the gentrification had happened. Traditionally in Dundas Valley, unlike some of the others, people were buying their own home, buying out of the gentrification that came with buying your own fibro home, moved on. That hasn't happened as much in some of the others. That was it made harder, but down to Tilapia to be the tougher to manage cases. So that's good that that responsibility can be taken on with the right level of funding from government as well. The flip side of social housing, and I grew up in an era when it was the houseos, or you can tell they're the commission house because that Maryland brick pit that was the basis for almost every bungalow and public housing built for years. That's flipping too now, isn't it? We're seeing, in some ways, instead of, oh my God, public housing being used as a way to prop up a marginal electorate, which governments in the past have done let's put 1,000 public housing places in, or make it, or move them, vice versa. Is there a hope we're seeing now that new design that comes with CHPs, innovative funding mechanisms, good case management, is there a case where the social housing element becomes part of a solution in an urban amenity way rather than being the bit you have to hide on the corner of the estate?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's planned in the master plan at Tilapia is a really good example of that. I take a bit of issue with the salt and pepper expression, because what that actually means is putting their social housing marginalised on the outskirts of the estate. That's not a good outcome. I think, to be fair to the government, there have been, within the Future Direction strategy, which is their housing strategy that's coming to an end, there was a requirement in that that the design of any new properties or any new estates make sure that it was social housing was indistinguishable from private housing. So I have seen that work. We have built our own properties that, in fact, we built a place in Hamilton Road in Fairfield that, you know, the Fairfield Council are telling us it's one of the best buildings in the city. And so it doesn't have to shout that it's affordable housing. And in fact, what you do is, if you are placing people in accommodation that's got the right amenity, then you will raise the level of pride that people have in their home. And social housing tenants will be they're just humans, the same as everybody else. They are entitled to access the same services. People still go to libraries and leisure centres and all of those things that come in an urban environment. I think it's really important that that stigma is removed. Yeah, and the design of the property absolutely does that.
Place matters.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for Matt and Nicola, and the work that you and your team do across Western Sydney and beyond now is remarkable. And maybe together we can finally move the dial on the whole housing equation.
I'm really looking forward to that, Chris.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Cheers.